morning. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our first presenter, Sandra Camarda. Sandra works as a research associate at the Luxembourg Center for Contemporary and Digital History, which functions within the University of Luxembourg, or Luxembourg, yes, it's more. Yeah. Yes. She has been awarded a Masters in Museum Anthropology and PhD in Anthropology from the University College London, specializing in visual culture and in the history of photography. In the past, she has conducted extensive research on American and European collections, exploring the use of photographs in the history of science and anthropology. At the University of Luxembourg, she recently completed a Marie Curie Actions. This is the foundation which founded the project on historical postcards of Luxembourg in relation to the construction of national identity. Her research interests focus on visual and material culture, the history of the First World War, and the strategies of use and display of museum collections in both real and virtual environments. She is currently involved in a digital history project developing a virtual exhibition on the Great War in Luxembourg, and this is the presentation of Sandra will deal with this project. The talk will offer an insight into development process behind the digital platform, which is called Remembering the Great War in Luxembourg, highlighting the challenges associated with bridging between multiple museum institutions and stakeholders, and the issues translating analog collections into the digital equivalents. Sorry. Yeah. So I'm giving floor to Dr. Sandra Camarda, and the title of the presentation is Translating Collections and Insight on Curating a Historical Multi-Layered Digital Exhibition on the Great War. Please.
Hello everyone, thank you again for this opportunity. I'm very happy to be here again in Lviv to discuss our project. As this is a seminar, I will be well, Taras asked me to focus on the organizational aspects of a bit of insight on the process of creation of this exhibition, and also on the various liaising with all the different stakeholders and institutions that we're part of the project. So this, if you want to, we'll be talking and leaving some time for questions after the talk, but if you wish to, raise some questions while I'm talking, please do so. So the Eichsfeld-Krieg project, Eichsfeld-Krieg is First World War in Luxembourgish. It's project collaboration between the University of Luxembourg and the Ministry of State, and it was born within the frame of the centenary celebrations. Now, it was actually being created on the ashes of a previous project, which was a real exhibition that was, again, being prepared by the university. Then, for some sort of obscure reasons, this exhibition was cancelled, and then it was resumed in a sort of digital form a year later. So officially, the Eichsfeld, the convention between the university and the government, was signed in 2015 with the idea of developing a digital platform for the history of the Great War in Luxembourg. Now, the Great War is, as I will explain in my talk this afternoon, it's really not a very felt period in Luxembourgish history. It wasn't very much studied. It was still a sort of very confused period that wasn't really addressed by the local historiography. So this project was really a chance to address an understudied period in Luxembourgish history. So, as we said, the framework was the centenary commemorations. The convention was signed in 2015 between Ministry of State and University. At that time, the C2DH, the Center for Contemporary and Digital History, was not yet created. So this was actually between the Ministry of State and the Institute of History. Then this project involved also all the institutions that depended from the Ministry of Culture. So National Library, National Archives, all the national museums of the country. Factually, the project started only in February 2016 with an initial core that was formed by 3 people. So 2 professors that were part-time, and then myself as project coordinator full-time. Then we had 1 student assistant, and we were supported by a so-called comité d'accompagnement, which was a sort of board, advisory board, constituted by representative of the cabinet of the Prime Minister, and also members like directors of local museums and institutions. Finally, the project was then launched in April 2018, so after 2 years of work. Now, if we go and see the institution, we had the National Archives, the National Library of Luxembourg, the Museum, National Museum of Military History, the Center for Audiovisuals, also a national institution, the Center for Migration, the City of Dudelange, the Museum of History and Art, and then also a partnership with Europeana 1418. Now, it was clear from the start that while we had a convention that technically guaranteed the collaboration of all these institutions, this was not enough, because given the type of materials, we needed to establish individual conventions with each one of these partners. Also to describe the use that we would make of this material. And obviously, as you can see, the material was very varied. So the National Library gave us a list of books and also illustrated postcards from that time. The National Archives, of course, had all the archival collection of documents, and particularly the very important were the material from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs during the war. Also, one kind of previously undiscovered corpus of material, which was compiled by the then state librarian called Ginsbach. And Ginsbach had prepared, they look really like scrapbooks, with collection of photographs and documents that he collected during the war and then put together. This material was again previously unresearched. Then, of course, Museum of Military History had a lot of objects, which we photographed and digitized anew. CNA had films, and we also sourced other type of films, particularly declassified material that was filmed during the American occupation of Luxembourg after the war, which was then acquired from, for example, from the National Archives in Washington, and then again various other kind of documentation. You can imagine that this was one of the challenges, because normally when you have digital exhibitions, they are displaying the content of one single institution, of one single collection, while here we had basically to mediate with very, very different materials, with very different metadata, and coming from all these different stakeholders. We also wanted to involve the local teachers, so we had a partnership with the Association of Luxembourgish History Teachers, and we conducted with them a series of focus groups and surveys to try to understand how the war was taught in Luxembourg, what kind of problems they encounter when discussing this period with the students. Then, of course, another aspect was basically the fact that while we were developing the exhibition, pretty much we started also the integration and the creation of the C2DH of the center. So the C2DH, well, if you see our center now, it has nearly 100 members of staff. We have some very specific expertises. We have, we know who's expert in what, and we have very clear structure. So when projects are developed, we have already quite a clear structure on how, you know, which people will be part of them and so on. At that time, obviously, this was all in a, you know, was being created. So the center was actually incorporating 4 different research institutions. So the CVCE that was dealing with sort of European studies, but with a kind of digital focus on the communication of European studies. Then the Museum of Resistance, the Center of Research on Resistance, focusing on the Second World War. Then another center of enrollment for this is the Luxembourgers that were forced to enroll in the Nazi army during the second occupation, during the Second World War. And then finally the the Center for European Studies, Robert Schumann. Then of course there was the integration of the staff from the history department, and we were part of them. And the 2 co-directors of the Interdisciplinary project became respectively the director of the C2DH and the head of the Luxembourg Study research unit. So of course this project was the first to migrate, and also the first flagship project of the C2DH. And then of course there was the creation of new positions. Now, particularly, the integration of the CVCE was instrumental for us and for our project, because the CVCE brought in a lot of knowledge on digital project that in the history department was not yet present. And particularly the work of Daniele here, who had been developing a known CMS, content management system called Miller, in the frame of a project he can tell you a bit more later on this. And it was basically a CMS designed specifically for historians and for researchers. Also, the beauty of Miller was that it allowed also to work directly on Google Sheets. So, and this was very helpful in a sense that we did not have to train the collaborators later during the project, because they could just work on you know, Excel sheets, on Google Sheets, and then this content would be automatically imported in the CMS. So we didn't need to train specifically people to work on the back end. Now, if we have a look at the organizational structure of the project, we have this kind of octopus where the core team of the C2DH is in the middle. At that stage, it was, again, the 2 co-directors, me, Daniele. Then the comité d'accompagnement was functioning as advisory board, but also as mediator between us and the Ministry of State. Technically, it was supposed also to how do you say, to also liaise and facilitate our relationship with the institution, but in fact, as I said, we had to establish individual collaborations with each one of these. Then we hired an external developer company to take care of the front end and the back end. Of the front end and design and development of the website. And this one was Calibro, and you'll hear more from them later. And then basically we had external collaborators. These were also groups of, you know, starting from private collectors or, you know, all people that might have an interest in this period, or might have like small collections, or might want to have perhaps an expertise on one particular aspect and wanted to collaborate. And then internal collaborators, and these were people either within the university or within the C2DH specifically, who helped with translations, with digitization, you know, writing of the content, you know, everything that, that you can think of in a project like this. Now, the challenges we had when starting this project was essentially that we needed this website to have an open structure. We did not want this website to be yet another project that is made for the centenary but then ends with the commemoration period. We wanted this to become a resource, a kind of growing resource for the Luxembourgers, but also in general, particularly because we had just started with this project to scratch the surface. We realized how little we knew about the war and how much we could integrate into this platform. Then, of course, there was the problem of audiences. We wanted this project to be accessible to various types of audiences, so not something just for the scholar, but to have a kind of public history aspect. And so we had to target the content to be accessible to all these different audiences, not just in terms of knowledge of the war, but also in terms of digital literacy. So how much people can know how to use you know, a platform, to navigate a website, and whether it was easy enough for them to, you know, to access, to have equal accessibility to the website. Then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we had to deal with all these different types of material coming from different institutions. Each institution had their own ways of digitizing, their own standards for metadata, different types of sources, and we had basically to find a way to encompass all these different collections. And then another big issue was the languages, because Luxembourg is multilingual. So the content had to be English, French, and German. These are the 3 official languages of the university. And then there was the problem of also making it available in Luxembourgish. The problem, though, is that Luxembourgish is, well, this was also, of course, a political question. The problem, though, is that Luxembourgish is mostly a spoken language. So we would have had a lot of difficulty in really translating this content, because sometimes we lack the vocabulary in Luxembourgish for, you know, we use a lot of borrowed words from French or from German. So we're still considering to add this 4th language in the future, also because after launch many people asked for this to be so. Just for your information, until recently all the sort of bureaucratical documents and contracts and of the government officially were in French, so not in Luxembourgish. So the solutions, we thought, okay, essentially 4 separate but interconnected modes of navigation. So a theme, a thematic section, a collection of like an archive of images, an interactive map, and then a chronology, a timeline. Plus 2 additional sections that would be tailored, one for scholars and one for the schools, for pupils and teachers. And then we wanted this kind of multi-layered structure that allowed users to move from one very basic, very accessible level of understanding of knowledge, and then the possibility of digging in, of diving and finding out more information and more complex content. If we have a look at the phases of the research, in an ideal world, everything is structured, but of course, when you start working on things, a lot of these phases overlap, and there are lots of iterations. So I would say we started with a preliminary survey and research on the material, because again, this was a part of history not very well known, so there was a lot of new material that we had to research and study, together with the liaising with the partner institution that somehow had to be convinced that this was a viable project, and they had to be also involved actively in the process of creating this project. Then a development phase, where of course we hired the external designer that they started working with Daniele on the development of the website. Alongside this phase, we kept on selecting, researching, and digitizing and doing essentially the data entry of the material. And this phase, I must say, continued pretty much towards the end, because our initial idea was to create this kind of big archive with with a lot of information, but then we realized when we had to compose the stories for our thematic section that sometimes we did not have the best images to tell those stories. So we had to go back to the archives and research and find more material that would fit into this, that would help us tell those stories. Then of course the content writing, proofreading, translation in 3 languages, and then our last phase of final test and debugging, so user tests and so on. Throughout all this time, we had also disseminations and side activities, and I will go to that in a second. Just to give you an example, this was one of the early designs that was ditched. So initially, we thought of having timeline and map not as individual sections, but as modalities of viewing the collection. But when we ran a few tests with some guinea pigs, we realized that actually this was very confusing, because also not every item has a geographic, a precise date or a geographical location. So this, of course, created an imbalance in the 3 sections. So eventually we decided to ditch this idea and to create, again, separate sections for this part. Now, for the dissemination and side activities, as the work was not enough, we decided to do a lecture series, teacher workshop, because we wanted to create also some interest in what we were doing, so stimulate people into knowing something more about the war. So we had, again, a lecture series and teacher workshops, which were focused on public history, digital public history projects. So we had, for example, Ian Grovelaw from the University of Birmingham, who is the director of this huge consortium called Voices of War and Peace, and that gathers basically all digital and public history project related to the war in the UK. Then we had Europeana 1418 that came to do a specific lecture on Europeana 1418 and on the transcribathon tool. Then we had some of these workshops, of course, were targeted for teachers. So we had actually, we collaborated with the Ministry of Education, so the IFAN. So the teachers would receive also credits for attending our workshops. And we did a few on digital storytelling related to World War I. Then we had a Forum Z, this was actually quite recent, for the centenary of the armistice. And this was an event targeted to a lay audience. We had also a Lanterna Magica projection using an original apparatus and slides from 1418. And then we had a real exhibition which focused on migrations and during World War I. This one took place in Dudelange at the Center for Migration, and this was a chance to make people also see some of the objects that then would be integrated in the digital platform, to see them in real. And this exhibition in particular, we worked with some video artists that created also a multimedia installation that was very immersive, and I must say we received a lot of positive feedback for this. Now, just very briefly, so this is the home page. Of course, you can have a look later. So you can see a very simple home page with 4 entry points. Again, the themes, the collection, the map, and the timeline. The theme, in particular, was one of the most difficult part to create, and the inspiration was a digital exhibition called Digital Stories, called from the Welcome Collection, and so this was the idea, and it was a sort of digital narrative with the idea of a theme, so a general theme, divided by chapters, and then each chapter divided into modules, like individual fragments of story. 5 chapters per story, 10 modules per chapter. And then we obviously agreed on a maximum size of this, so each module of text contained about 70, 100 words, because obviously we had to think in terms of readability. Now, the challenge was basically to make each one of this module and chapter to be readable independently, because we didn't want to force readers into a straight story. We wanted them to be able to navigate and explore the site the way they wanted. So basically, again, each one of this module had to work independently and then function within the chapter and then within this whole story. So just to give you an idea of the structure, so you had the chapter, so the theme, the division into modules, and then each one of these modules could be then detached, and then each document presented in this visual module could be then also individually explored. So we try to give as much as possible a sort of horizontal way of navigating these digital stories. Now, bridging between the CMS and the Miller and the front end, we had a visual editor. Again, Daniele will explain this much more in detail, so I'm just going very quickly on this. The point again of the visual editor, which was again tailor-made for this exhibition, was to allow to compose and edit the stories, the themes, and also the static pages of the educational section, for example. So just because we're short of time, I'll just go very quickly, and then again you can browse through the website and see these things by yourself. So the collection was then created with an idea of generous interface, so not just a blank page with a search button, but you know, an infinite scroll of items that would encourage this sort of random discovery of things. The interactive map that, of course, it was zoomable at street level and had this around me function that gave the possibility of using the website a bit as a touring app, because it would point you to locations that were relevant for the war. And then a timeline, and of course timelines are very deceiving in a sense that, especially in museology, they appear as this you know, very neutral instrument of historical knowledge, but in fact they are they are narratives, they are structured. So the idea was to mitigate this with adding the documents to the events. So by going through the timeline, it was also possible to navigate the collection. So this, again, just to conclude, this is basically the website, and I thank you for your attention. Again, this is the URL of both I forgot to say that all this is open source, and again, it's available, and this is the URL of the website, and this is the address of the code.
Thank you Sandra. I'm going to invite our second speaker in the morning, Taras Nazaruk. Taras Nazaruk works at the Center for Urban History. He obtained his master's degree in communication design at the University of Wrocław in Poland, and a bachelor's degree in journalism from the International University in Lviv. He also studied at Nazaruk University in Brno and worked in different digital projects, web projects mainly. Taras works at the Center for Urban History on the project which is called Lviv Interactive, and this will be the subject of his presentation. Lviv Interactive is a project of mapping history of the city in developing, and is developing as a project in making with over 10 years of its own history. At the same time, it is not just a history of published research materials focusing on urban studies. It is also a history of accumulated experiences of mapping, historical research, interdisciplinary cooperation, and using digital tools. And insofar as the early morning section is called Interdisciplinarity, Taras will also focus on a complicated interdisciplinary nature of digital project, which is called Lviv Interactive. Please, Taras.
Thank you, Bogdan. Thank you, everyone. I guess the questions and answer and feedback session we will have after the second presentation. Then we can have some questions to both those presentations and projects. So I will start with a short overview of the Lviv Interactive project, and then we'll elaborate more on this interdisciplinary nature of the project, but also what this implied basically, but not only interdisciplinarity itself, but what this also implies from such a kind of project as Lviv Interactive or digital history projects in general. So Lviv Interactive project exists since 2007. It was considered as a possibility to represent history of Lviv on the map, as you can see here on this map, for example. One of the most considerable results of Lviv Interactive project so far is the developed structure of materials based on the history as a text. Many invited authors applied their own researches and existing historiography to prepare a set of entries about the history of Lviv. Various specialists were involved in the team of the project to unify, structure, manage this set of entries into encyclopedia format. Communicating those materials to various audiences, the same as for Luxembourg project, is still our aim, and again, it's still our challenge for this project. At the same time, the experience of using digital tools is passing across all the stages of Lviv Interactive. And it was, in my opinion, less in the focus and was not considered as such an outcome of Lviv Interactive as well. So what is seen among the upcoming tasks for us now is to document and analyze the way those tools were used for history as a hypertext. This presentation is one of the attempts toward this. Initially, there was a map developed with basic descriptions about places and spaces. Eventually, the project published fundamental platform of texts.
Nice. It's like music.
Is it my maybe? Maybe give this one. This would be easier. Okay. Is it fine? Okay. So initially there was a map developed. The map was basic descriptions about places and spaces, and eventually the published materials. The project published fundamental platform of text and visual information about buildings and architecture in the format of sort of encyclopedia. Those entries about buildings and places have helped to mark various spatial related narratives and themes, from spatially it allowed to zoom in and zoom out from a city as a whole, as the entire structure, to show, to narrow it down to, let's say, some particular neighborhoods, or even down to specific streets, and describe spatially some kind of streets, neighborhoods, or even then to this lowest level as the building down to the building. And all of those entries are geo-referenced and thematically published materials consider cultural, social, architectural history of the city. It is possible to find and compare materials about various architectural styles, different communities and networks from religious, cultural, or social perspectives. So basically here you can see materials structured by theme. In this particular case, it's modernism architecture in Lviv. So not only spatially, like neighborhood or street, but also special reference to a specific theme. Each particular entry about the place consists of architectural description, context of a space through map, but also through imagery. And imagery also helps to understand the place better from a visual perspective. And also we have archival imagery from Urban Media Archive, which is another digital project of the center, and it allows to compare and analyze dynamic of this space as well as its visual representation through different medias. An important and even fundamental part of the project is its relational structure. So that each entry can be defined as a part of a wider range of entries by using relations. For a place, it can be related, for instance, with the nearby buildings that form an architectural complex, but also relations to people and institutions. Like you can see here, we have a description of a building, but then we have also a relation to university as an institution that was located in this building. This way we started inhabiting those buildings with people, institutions and activities in a more structured way. It is important in case of building as we aim to tell rather the history through places than history of places. It is difficult to tell the story of a related person or an institution in the text about building because the story about building does not equal to the story about institution. The same building can be a place for various institutions, or a single institution can be in many places, even simultaneously. This also can change the way you prepare an entry and structure them into spatial thematic narrative. Approaches for mapping not only the history of places, but also the history through places, structured encyclopedia gradually and was based on previous experiences, more or less efficient experiences and experiments within the project. Eventually, unified structure and texts were developed in order to give a possibility to read and analyze material under the same logic. Some amount of the content that brought us to this way remain unpublished during this process. So now we have entries about places, people, institutions, and some activities. And through relations and metadata, those entries are structured into some narratives and data sets. This multidimensional non-linear structure became possible mainly because of two very specific aspects of digital technology. I'll show this picture to you. On this picture you can see Lviv Interactive Encyclopedia entries as of 2013 and printed out on paper. This was prepared for some practical workshop, and its purpose was a group discussion and scientific editing of the texts. I think that this at first glance funny picture is very important. And I'm happy that I found this print out while started working on this project in 2016, because it's not just about transferring to a paper something genuinely digital. Very often it reasonably serves for some practical and theoretical tasks. Let's just think how many papers and books about digital projects were printed out over the last decades of existing of digital humanities as a field. Text still remains the ultimate core for organizing and structure the knowledge that was produced, even if it's based on the digital tools. And this picture shows that Lviv Interactive as an encyclopedia is and will be primarily considered as a text with all the approaches that are applicable to its creation and consuming. However, this picture points out the additional value of the project, which seems to be quite obvious, but because of that, it is also less discussed and analyzed. I mean such aspects of digital technology as hypertext and data. The amount of text that is shown on the picture is too large to relatively quickly build system of interrelation between those paper cards. Therefore, our possibilities to structure those cards in various sets, as well as to navigate them, are limited. What we can do is to use a book format as an interface and apply it to this set of text for efficient navigation. In this manner, when we talk about the history as a text, Lviv Interactive as an encyclopedia consists of over 1,000 entries about the history of the city. Ways of structuring this as a database, searching for formats to interact with this data, as well as documentation of the experience, is a part that we call lab. Now I'll show you another picture that illustrates Lviv Interactive project from a different side. We cannot see any kind of texts here, no photographs or maps. But what we can see is the metadata of each particular entry or picture and system of interrelation between those entries and metadata. It was prepared to look more carefully at this less visible, but as we see, enormous, less visible part of Lviv Interactive. If on the previous picture we have an access to entries that could tell us about specific place, on this visualization we have a glimpse of what we can call a database and its relational nature. But we obviously have limited possibilities to navigate through it and access some information about some particular place. In this manner, Lviv Interactive project is also an experiment and experience of building a framework where you can explore the history of the city through having entries about a particular theme, but also navigating through dynamic, entangled and multidimensional structure of entries. Although our long-term goal is to be as thorough as possible, Lviv Interactive is far from covering all of the topics about the history of the city. So it's not representative in terms of themes or narratives, but its hypertext nature gives us a chance to construct those themes and narratives about the city in a less linear way. Here we are making our attempts towards history as a hypertext. So our experiments for modes of navigation resulted in various versions of interfaces. I will show you some of them. Let's say this interface in 2000, this is the Lviv Interactive project in 2008, one of the first interfaces. Back then there was no Google Maps solution to visualize georeference data, so some projects tried to georeference scanned maps or use some other GIS-based digital opportunities, for example like S3, which exists still. This one map was received from the state enterprise Cartografia, dealing with cartography and mapping in Ukraine, and it was used for some period of time for the project. In 2000, this is the map, this is the Lviv Interactive, how it looked like in 2014. Here we can see that we started using Google Maps API for visualizing data. Well, it's not just issue of using this or that map. It is also an issue of technical framework in which project exists and coexists with other projects. In many senses, it is much more easier to apply Google Maps to our project than the previous Cartografia solution or many other available solutions. But at the same time, we limit ourselves to Google Maps solution, to Google Maps and its framework. If you are at this stage of the project, let's say we would like to replace Google Maps with OpenStreetMaps, it would imply some complications due to interoperability issues between those two technologies and those two frameworks. So choosing technology to use in digital history projects, it is always a decision. But in my opinion, it is not just a matter of visual representation or technology, it is also a matter of project sustainability. Next visualizations were attempts to find solutions for more complex and complicated structure of published materials. As I mentioned previously, from a history about place, we started moving towards a history through the place. So more entries about people, institutions, activities appeared in the structure. Not only buildings had to be visualized with relation to space, but also stories of personalities and institutions, which is more dynamic and less linear. And we came out with the result that we have right now. It's not perfect, it's far from what we want to have, and we're still working on it, but this is, at the moment, this is our result for the project. Besides that, some sort of side projects and collaborations appeared, which were developed as a part of Lviv Interactive project. But they had different goals, structures, and visualizations. For example, this map, let me show you. This map, Lviv at Great War, in 2014 was prepared. This map emerged as a part of exhibition about Great War, and it was organized here in the center. Its site-specific purposes as an exhibition display, so it's slightly different than just interface for a computer. This format later had its this format later had its continuation as a map about the Polish-Ukrainian war in Lviv in November 2018, and recently we prepared this map about November 1918 in Lviv using as a template map that was prepared for Lviv Great War. Another project that the imaginary map of literal Lviv was created as an attempt to visualize research on the writers' networks in the city in 1939. The research was based on the methodology topos, tropos, and tropos. It was visualized mainly as the network graph. This methodology offers interesting approach to study and visualize social networks with its relation to space. There will be more about this methodology in the next block of the seminar. There were also attempts with storytelling formats for special related narratives. For example, the project about secessionist ensemble of Bohomolce Street, where we are located right now, where the center is located. It was an attempt to tell about the city through the story of one particular street, and this street was chosen not just because the Center for Urban History is located here, but because of its story, because of the story of this street can tell more about urban planning ideas in the city. In the beginning of the 20th century, it is also a story about people related to its construction or who lived here. Through their personal stories, we can basically highlight the audience to the audience specific historical context of the entire city. And another example of digital storytelling that we tried is we also experimented with open source storytelling tools. We used Odyssey.js tool and started adapting it to our needs. Several stories have been already prepared based on this tool, but we still need to work on improvements. And we think that eventually our version of improvements might be also published to use or reuse by other projects. So those experience of building navigation for the city as a hypertext highlighted three main modes of using Lviv Interactive based on purposes. The first one from particular to general. In this way you have no start and no ending. It gives no entry point. It gives a possibility to restructure Lviv Interactive datasets according to questions raised. From a simple where modernist building from the interval period are located in the city to some more complicated. This gives a space for an experiment and analyzes within this structure. Basically the way we see it here. We have the entire structure presented on a map, and then we using different filters, and we can restructure it in a way that we need according to our questions, according to spheres, chronology, if it's building architectural styles, different spaces and places, and so on. So there is no entry point to this map, and each question would lead to different results based on the used filters. Another mode is from general to details. It's quite opposite from a previous perspective. Here we need an entry point page from which user can have an overview of narratives that were structured and presented on Lviv Interactive. This page is currently under development and will be available soon. I can show it some draft of this page. Here we have structured all the topics and narratives, themes basically that we have prepared during the project. So there's another way of interaction with the material when you go from the general to some specific details later on presented on a map. And the third one, as I called it, machines as user. This is the format of interface we have just started considering recently, so I want to elaborate on it a little bit more. Todd Presner, from the chair of the Digital Humanities program at the University of California in Los Angeles, described his experience with developing Hypercities project as thick mapping, approach to map multidimensional, non-linear structure of a city. He emphasizes one of the main shifts in the World Wide Web this way. Web is no longer a set of pages of info, but a set of interfaces to data. It comes from a technical solution called AJAX that was introduced in the 90s and became widespread in May 2000. As far as I understand it from my non-technical background, it allowed page to request specific parts of data from a database without reloading entire page. In practical terms, it means that there is no need to reload entire Facebook page once you send your like to someone's post. It's just only this part of data, meaning like button, that has been changed in the database and then consequently changed on the web page. It causes web developers to think about displays as bits of data to expose in a variety of formats. Then the web became no longer a set of pages of info, but a set of interfaces to data. In general, it means that your project would take and use data from another project without considering the visual interface of this external project. In my opinion, digital humanities should emphasize thinking about their project this way. This is because concepts of software and visual interface are constantly iterating, at least in a much more accelerated way than data. Thus, data is much more easier to repurpose than software, which makes project more sustainable for software changes, but also brings new opportunity for different digital humanities projects to interplay and remain interoperable, compatible with each other. In other words, with Lviv Interactive API, if we will create it, you can use our materials, but you don't need to have in your project the same map that we have or the same icons that we have. Visual interface is more for human to navigate and receive information that is needed. And for a machine, an API is the interface to get the data from Lviv Interactive, and it is separate from its visual representation. Tomo Tasovac from the Belgrade Center for Digital Humanities frames it as an infrastructural term for digital humanities, which makes API infrastructure also a part of research infrastructure. However, Dan Cohen from Northeastern University emphasized that despite its potential, API is not that widespread in digital humanities than in commercial realm, for example. The study of Trinity College in Dublin on Europeana Cloud project also came into conclusion in 2016 that very few humanities researchers use this API. So there are different perspectives on that. However, we see a lot of opportunities there for applying results of Lviv Interactive in various external projects. Although we have some ideas on how our material can be utilitarian, it is basically impossible to foresee directions in which our API resources and tools could go. API makes data for external projects consumable in many forms. Digital Cohen from Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media notes that digital history requires a framework on an ontology through the technology for people to experience, read, and allow an argument about historical problem. Building API interface seems to be the closest step to this framework. And taking everything presented into account, I'll make some conclusions. So Lviv Interactive has an experience of using digital instruments, but this experience is not enough documented and reflected, partly because this is a way of trials and mistakes, but partly because there is a lack of wider sustainable digital humanities platform where this discussion could exist, which is interesting enough for a country with so many technical companies. like Ukraine. Technology in this project is not just a technical issue. This is a matter of sustainability. Technology is constantly iterating. For example, if you had used Flash technology for this project somewhere in the past, it might have implied a lot of complications for us today. However, it's not just about being up-to-date or sufficient with recent technology solutions. It is rather about being sustainable in using it. Thus, Lviv interactive outcome should be considered not only as prepared materials, but also as a hypertext ontology, as database from a perspective, how this can be used further. This might sound quite obvious for technical specialists, but humanities specialists focus considerably less on it. In this manner, interdisciplinarity of Lviv Interactive requires constant communication and discussion between technical specialists and historians, not just for exchanging expertise, but also for searching for a joint expertise. And inclusion of Lviv Interactive into a wider discussion on digital history should be seen not only as a produced text, but also as a hypertext and database by using such solutions like an API. Thank you for your attention.
We have still 15 minutes for questions and answers, and if you have any.
I have a question to Sandra. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned that you have two sections.
Sorry. I will give another one.
That you have two sections tailored for schools and scholars. Does it mean that you from the beginning define your target group as pupils and scholars?
No, this is just one of the modalities.
It's like additional.
This is an additional, two additional sections. Basically one section, I didn't give you a tour of the website because I was leaving it for later, but essentially we have two additional pages in the website. One is tailored for the schools and teachers, so it offers some pedagogical manuals, and these were developed together with the history teachers that, again, teachers can use in the classroom with their pupils to explore World War I in Luxembourg. And then we have a section that is more for scholars, more for the kind of experts, with essentially a series of specialist articles on various topics that you can download and read. So this is just two additional sections as extending from the kind of more general audience that is the target of the...
So my question will be, so how did you define your target group? Did you define any, or it just...
well, I mean, we did some profiling when developing and thinking of the design, also together with Calibro, George is just there, just here. So it was trying to imagine who would be the possible various typologies of audience, because there's not just one audience. Obviously, it's a very specific topic, so you can't expect everyone to be interested in World War I. So it would be, one part would be, experts on local history. There would be obviously the academics. There would be the schools. There would be also general public that might have an interest in local history. So we try to kind of imagine, and to profile a bit what you do when you design a normal exhibition, that you try to imagine and to draw a profile of various typologies of audiences. And then we try to create paths within the website to accommodate all these different needs.
Okay, thank you. Good.
Yeah, I had a question for Taras. You talk about interoperability, but also you mentioned compatibility. And before this encyclopedic approach to the project and to the data, I was wondering if you integrate Wikidata into your project or the Wikidata structure, because this is as far as I know, a way to integrate back the data and the relationship you build up in this project to a more sustainable project, which is the data behind the Wikipedia, indeed.
Thank you for your question. Yes, we should look more thoroughly on the structure of data in Wikidata and what is behind this information. But when it comes to materials, basically this encyclopedia is structured based on the texts and materials prepared by researchers. So we usually we request those texts and those materials from different scholars in order to prepare some research-based information and then to publish it on Lviv Interactive. And but the structure developed basically based on these materials that we received. It wasn't something that we defined from the beginning. That the structure that we have right now, it changed. It's still constantly changing according to the materials that we have, that we received, and that we want to have. So this was the main core of the way of thinking for us about the structure of data on the interactive. But in case of Wikidata, maybe there are some technical solutions that are useful and interesting for us. But I think that we should discuss this with our technical also specialists, how we can make this if it's possible to make compatible information that is structured on our website and our database with the structure that is in Wikidata.
Okay. Do you have any more questions?
I actually have a follow-up question from the previous question to Sandra about this education activities and workshops and audience also in school and education basically. Do you have so far? Do you have any feedbacks, any comments from schools, from teachers, how it's used, and in general how they perceive it?
Yes, I mean one aspect that I didn't mention is that we gave also the possibility to teachers to upload the project that they do based on a website on the exhibition. So that there would be eventually an integration also of the project that the teachers do with the class using a website. And in particular, a couple of weeks ago, we got an email from one of these teachers, and he used the website to create a sort of Instagram page with the students based on the site. So they went around tracing the places with the app and took pictures and then used the website to basically compose this sort of itinerary through Luxembourg city. So in a way we know that the teachers are using this material because there was very little information also on sources. So for the teachers this is an extremely useful tool to again also to collect information and to use also primary sources in the classroom.
I also have a question to Sandra. In general, about the institution, because you come from the Center for Contemporary and Digital History, and you mentioned that the center was founded kind of within the project development of this First World War, but then you have already a lot of different other projects at the center.
At the center, yes,
yeah.
yes.
And so my question is that you mentioned that this project was in the early stage started by 2 part-time professors and then you as coordinator and then assistant. But do you have at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History some specific lab, as Nazar mentioned, or at least a space or a seminar where you discuss the general ideology of the digital projects? Do you have any kind of vertical or horizontal, I don't know, gatherings and discussing different projects and how it happens actually?
Yeah, we have a series of general meetings and also meetings of the individual research units that constitute the project. So we have, once a month we meet with our own research unit, we discuss our project, we also think about possibilities and evaluate what we do. Then we have a series of events that we do. For example, the forum said that it's destined to lay audience, and this is also an occasion for us to reflect on this kind of dissemination of history, how to bring, what are the best ways to involve a lay audience in local history. And and then we have also general meetings with the whole department. There is also a management team that collects the ideas from the research units and then discuss them and prepares basically future plans and reflects. But there is a constant reflections on methods and strategies.
And then how you define who is in charge of making decision about the milieu or whether to work with Calibro or so how the kitchen looks like?
Well, those particular decisions are usually left within the research, the core teams, the project teams. So the project teams decides on a strategy, and then so that it's not top-down decisions there. So it's based on the expertise of that group and based also on the needs of that group that additional expertise is sought and people are hired essentially.
Because we continuously have issues that historians with no background in technology, we don't really know which technology is better or worse, and so basically we do a lot of mistakes.
Also the hiring process wasn't so linear. I mean, also we went through several. We issue a call for tender. We examine at least 10 different proposals from external designers. But then we were happier with Calibro because Calibro, coming from an academic background, could understand better than others the necessity of the project. Because most of the companies we spoke with were treating historical data as a product to advertise. And this, of course, was an issue. But Calibro, having worked extensively on a digital humanities project, could understand exactly what kind of problems we had, also with the fuzziness of historical data, the fact that you need to develop special strategies to display it, special strategies to handle all this material.
And in case of these 8 big institutions that were involved in this single project development, did you have any mediation body? So I mean, was it you?
As I said, in the if you think back to the structure, technically the Comité d'accompagnement was supposed to mediate between also us and the institution. Factually, you can't have just, because each institution has their own agendas, each institution has their own methods, and so we had again to bypass that and establish individual collaboration with each one of them. And of course, that's so mediation and trying to find a middle ground, because each institution had their own agenda and their own needs.
Okay. Thank you. Czy jeszcze zapytanie? Do you have any more questions? If no, we can continue in the mode of flying bees, because we have a break, half-an-hour break for coffee, and then we come back to this room to continue with next session, more related to research. Thank you.